She was just 13 years old, a child forced into marriage with a man twice her age. Within a year, she was pregnant, her body torn apart by a childbirth so brutal it nearly killed her. But here's the twist, that baby boy would grow up to become the first Tudor king. This is not a fairy tale. It's the brutal, heartbreaking and shocking story of Margaret Beaufort, the girl who was treated as a pawn, but became the mother of a dynasty. Was she a tragic victim or the secret mastermind behind the Tudors? Let's find out. Picture this. A baby girl is born in 1443, carrying a bloodline that could shake a kingdom. Her name, Margaret Beaufort. Now, when most children are born, their parents dream of happiness, of safety, of a bright future. But Margaret's birth was different. She wasn't just a baby, she was a prize, a living claim to the English throne. And in the 15th century, that was more dangerous than a crown of thorns. You see, Margaret came from the Beaufort line, descendants of John of Gaunt, son of King Edward III. Royal blood ran through her veins, but not cleanly enough to be simple. The Beauforts were considered legitimate, but questionable. That meant she was both valuable and vulnerable. In the eyes of ambitious men, she wasn't a child. She was a tool, and England at that time, it was chaos. Civil war brewed like a storm, the Wars of the Roses, where rival families, York and Lancaster, tore the kingdom apart for power. A girl like Margaret was a pawn everyone wanted to control. Think about it. While other little girls were learning songs and games, Margaret's fate was being decided in castles and council chambers. Who would marry her? Who would use her claim to the throne? She didn't get a say. Her future was not her own. From the moment she could walk, whispers followed her everywhere. She will give us a king. She will give us a king. But here's the tragedy. She was just a child. She should have been protected, nurtured, free to grow. Instead, her very existence was a political weapon, and when the king himself, Henry VI, looked at her, he didn't see a 12-year-old girl. He saw a womb. A chance to strengthen his dynasty. A tool for power. Margaret Beaufort was born an heiress, yes, but hers was an inheritance no one would envy. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't happiness. It was a curse that would steal her childhood, her freedom, and nearly her life, because at the age of just 12, Margaret's path was sealed. She was promised to a man twice her age, and by 13, she was forced into a role no child should ever bear. Her life as a pawn in the game of kings was only just beginning. And soon, she would be married off, not as a bride, but as a sacrifice. Imagine being 12 years old, still playing with dolls, still learning how to write your name neatly, still a child. Now imagine being told that your life, your body, your future, it no longer belongs to you. That was the reality for Margaret Beaufort. At just 12, her fate was sealed. The king had chosen her husband, Edmund Tudor, the king's own half-brother. Edmund was not a boy her age, not a companion she could grow with. He was a man, at least twice her age, ambitious, calculating and fully aware of what Margaret represented. To Edmund, she wasn't a wife. She was an opportunity, a direct line to the throne, a vessel to produce an heir who could secure his family's power. And so, the marriage went forward. The law, the church, and the crown all agreed. This 13-year-old girl would become a wife. There was no celebration, no girlish excitement. This wasn't a love story. It was a transaction. A child handed over like property for the sake of dynastic ambition, and Edmund wasted no time. He claimed his rights as a husband immediately, forcing Margaret into a role she could neither understand nor escape. She was only 13. Think about that. 13. And already she was expected to carry the weight of the kingdom in her womb. The whispers that had followed her since birth, "She will give us a king," were no longer whispers. They were demands, and soon enough Margaret realized the terrifying truth. She was pregnant. Her tiny frame, her fragile body, would now be pushed to the absolute limit. Doctors, priests, and servants all knew the risks. Pregnancy for a grown woman was dangerous in the 15th century. But for a child, it could be fatal. Did Margaret have a choice? No, she was trapped. A prisoner in her own body, forced to grow up overnight, her childhood stolen forever. And as her belly grew, so did the fear. Could she survive this? Would she die in childbirth? Or would she somehow deliver the heir Edmund and the king so desperately wanted? At 13 years old, Margaret Beaufort was not dreaming of her future. She was fighting to stay alive, and when the time came for her to give birth, it was nothing short of a nightmare. And when the time came for her to give birth, it was nothing short of a nightmare. Margaret Beaufort was only 13, barely more than a child herself, when she carried the weight of England inside her. Her small frame, her undeveloped body, everyone knew it wasn't ready for the strain of childbirth. But there was no turning back. The pregnancy had begun, and survival was no longer guaranteed. Imagine the fear. In the 15th century, childbirth was already one of the most dangerous experiences a woman could face. Even grown women died in droves. But for Margaret, the risk was unimaginable. Her household whispered prayers. Her attendants looked on with pity. And Margaret, just a girl, clung to her faith. Every movement, every sign of weakness was a reminder. This could kill her. She walked carefully, prayed constantly, and lived with the dread that her own body might betray her. And yet she also knew the pressure was enormous. This child was not just her baby. It was the potential heir to the throne. Failure wasn't an option. Month after month her belly grew, while her fear deepened. The pain, the exhaustion, the whispers of death at her doorstep, it was overwhelming. But Margaret had no choice. At only 13, she was forced to endure what grown women feared most. And then came the moment. The labor, hours upon hours of agony. Her cries echoed through the halls. Servants rushed back and forth, priests prayed, midwives struggled. Every second felt like an eternity, every breath a battle. At one point, it seemed certain Margaret wouldn't survive. Her body was too small, the labor too long. But against all odds, through blood, sweat, and sheer willpower, she brought a child into the world. A boy. A fragile infant who would be named Henry Tudor, but this victory came at a devastating cost. The birth left Margaret permanently scarred. The trauma to her young body was so severe that she would never have another child again. At just 14 years old, her future as a mother ended the very moment it began. She had survived. Her son had lived, but the price was enormous. Margaret's childhood was gone forever. Stolen by duty, by politics, by ambition, and as she struggled to recover, fate delivered another cruel twist. Margaret was about to face widowhood. Margaret Beaufort had done the impossible. At just 14, she had survived a childbirth that should have killed her. Her son, Henry Tudor, lay swaddled in blankets, a fragile child born of blood, fear, and pain. For a moment, the world might have expected celebration, but there was no joy here. Only exhaustion, only scars. Margaret's body had been pushed beyond its limits. The labor had left her broken. Her hips, her frame, her very health were permanently damaged. Doctors and midwives knew the truth, though they whispered it in private. Margaret would never safely bear another child. She was a mother now, but her motherhood had come at the cost of her future, and remember, she was still only 14. A girl who should have been learning, playing, living, now trapped in a body wrecked by trauma, bound forever to a destiny she never chose. But if Margaret thought her suffering had reached its peak, fate had one more cruel twist. Her husband, Edmund Tudor, the man who had forced her into this nightmare, was dead. He died of the plague, while Margaret was still recovering from childbirth. Just like that, she was a widow, not even 15 years old. And already widowed, with an infant son to protect. Think about the weight on her shoulders, alone, vulnerable in a kingdom tearing itself apart through the wars of the roses. Her son was valuable, too valuable. A boy with a claim to the throne, a boy who could be used by ambitious lords. Enemies and allies alike were already watching, calculating, waiting for their chance to control him. And who stood between them and Henry? A 14-year-old girl. Margaret had no wealth to wield, no army to defend her, no power except her unshakable determination. And yet, that determination was enough. She poured every ounce of herself into survival, into protecting the tiny life she had risked everything to bring into the world. She prayed, she plotted, and she endured. The girl who had been treated as a pawn was learning piece by piece how to play the game herself. But the world of kings and crowns was merciless. If Margaret wanted to protect her son, she would have to grow sharper, stronger, and far more ruthless than anyone expected. Because now, her survival wasn't just about her own life. It was about shielding her son from the deadly storm of the Wars of the Roses. Margaret Beaufort was barely 14 years old, widowed, scarred from childbirth, and left with only one thing that mattered: her son, Henry Tudor. But Henry wasn't just her baby. He was a prize, a potential heir to the throne. And in the middle of the Wars of the Roses, a brutal civil war ripping England apart, that made him a target. Margaret knew it. Everyone knew it. Her child was valuable enough to be stolen, manipulated, or even killed. And who stood between him and the vultures circling above? A teenage girl with nothing but her faith and her determination. Think about it. The world saw her as weak, powerless, a victim of circumstance. But Margaret refused to break. She leaned into her piety, believing that God had chosen her for this role. Every prayer she whispered wasn't just for strength. It was for strategy. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was learning how to fight. Her marriage to Edmund Tudor had left her tied to the powerful Tudor family, and she wasn't about to let go of that connection. To secure her son's safety, Margaret remarried quickly to Sir Henry Stafford, a man of influence who could offer her some protection. It wasn't love, it was survival. Every decision she made now was about shielding Henry, but England was not a safe place. The Yorkists and Lancastrians clashed in bloody battles. Kings rose and fell. Treason, betrayal, and death were everywhere. Margaret moved carefully, quietly, always calculating. She knew one mistake could cost her everything. Through it all, she played her part perfectly, the obedient, pious widow. No one suspected just how sharp her mind had become. Behind her prayers, behind her calm demeanor, Margaret was weaving alliances, building trust, and waiting for her moment, because she believed utterly and completely that her son was destined for greatness, that Henry Tudor, the fragile boy she nearly died to bring into the world, was meant to wear a crown. But belief alone wouldn't be enough. The Wars of the Roses were not forgiving. Families were destroyed. Innocent blood filled the fields. And Margaret knew, if Henry was to survive, she would have to be smarter, tougher, and more ruthless than the men who ruled the battlefield. And in the years to come, Margaret Beaufort, the girl who had once been a pawn, would transform into something far more dangerous, the mastermind who built the Tudor dynasty. Margaret Beaufort began life as a pawn, a child bride, a victim of politics, a girl who nearly died giving birth at just 14. But history does not remember her only for her suffering. No, Margaret Beaufort became something far greater. As the Wars of the Roses raged on, kings came and went. Henry VI was toppled. Edward IV seized power. The throne changed hands like a bloody prize. But through it all, Margaret never lost sight of one thing: her son, Henry Tudor. She protected him with a ferocity no one expected from a quiet, pious widow. She arranged alliances in whispers, secured powerful marriages, and learned the art of patience. Every move she made was for the future, Henry's future. For years, Henry lived in exile across the sea in Brittany, far from England's deadly politics. Many thought his claim would vanish into nothing, that he'd be forgotten. But Margaret never stopped believing. To her, he wasn't just her child, he was destiny itself. And destiny finally answered. In 1485, after decades of bloodshed, Henry Tudor landed in England. At the Battle of Bosworth Field, he faced Richard III, the last Yorkist king. Against the odds, Henry won. Richard was slain, and Margaret's fragile son, the boy she had nearly died to bring into the world, was crowned Henry VII, King of England. In that moment, Margaret Beaufort's suffering, her sacrifices, her ruthless determination, all of it bore fruit. She had given England a new dynasty, the Tudors, But let's not romanticize it too much. This was not a fairy tale. Margaret's life had been stolen from her as a child. She endured what no girl should ever endure, and yet she transformed her pain into power. From victim to strategist, from pawn to kingmaker, from forgotten girl to the mother of a dynasty. She lived long enough to see her son rule, long enough to see her grandson, Henry VIII, born. And though she never wore a crown herself, her fingerprints are on one of the most powerful dynasties in English history. Margaret Beaufort's story is both tragic and extraordinary. She was forced into a nightmare at 13, but she rose from that nightmare to shape the destiny of a kingdom. So, I'll leave you with this question. Was Margaret Beaufort simply a victim of her time, or was she the secret architect of the Tudor throne?